Mr. Willy Wonka can make marshmallows that taste of violets and rich caramels that change color every 10 seconds as you suck them, and little feathery sweets that melt away deliciously the moment you put them between your lips. He can make chewing gum that never loses its taste, and candy balloons that you can blow up to enormous sizes before you pop them with a pin and gobble them up. And by a most secret method, he can make lovely little blue birds' eggs with black spots on them. And when you put one of these in your mouth, it gradually gets smaller and smaller until suddenly there is nothing left except a tiny little pink sugary baby bird sitting at the tip of your tongue.
Ho-dee-oh, 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 ho. Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And this time we are reading Roald Dahl's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory.
Yes.
Just in time for Thanksgiving, American style.
And even though you may not be eating candy at Thanksgiving, certainly you'll be feasting, so it should go pretty well.
Yes, indeed. Oh boy. This is quite a book. So we've looked at two books that, while you were reading them, at times made you hungry. Did this book also make you hungry?
What an interesting question, because it's full of food and deliciousness and evocations of hunger and satiation, but I don't find it mouthwatering the way I found, especially the last book we read, MFK Fisher's How to Cook a Wolf. I found it vivid and glittery, I find it captures my imagination more than my taste buds.
I think that opening passage you read is one of the most taste bud tantalizing passages in the book, actually.
But it's also fantastical, right? Feathery sweets and then the bird at the tip of your tongue. It's almost hallucinogenic kind of, right?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the main points of this is just how magical these kinds of sweets can be.
Yeah, well, so much of it is fantasy food. Remember we talked about fantasy food when we were reading MFK Fisher, that there were recipes that were abject. There were recipes that were totally reasonable ones you might want to try yourself, and which you did with War Cake. But then there were also almost absurd kinds of recipes that were more aspirational or imaginative. Every food in this book just about is imaginative and aspirational, except for, I think, significantly, the plainer chocolate bars that appear, especially in the early part of the book, as something that satiates your hunger and fills you up when you're almost starving. And that's kind of neat to think about.
Well, and some of the poverty food that Charlie's family is eating at the beginning of the book when they have very little money and very few resources, when they're eating boiled cabbage, basically.
Yeah, the boiled cabbage soup, it's not even boiled cabbage. It's hasn't got much cabbage in it. It's
diluted.
Yeah, right? Yes, reminiscent of Fisher's sludge, right?
I don't know. I'd rather have the boiled cabbage soup than the sludge, I'll have to admit. But yeah, this is a somewhat different book for us. We have done some children's literature, that is to say, books that were written for children before when we did Little Women back in the day. But this feels more children-y than that.
Yeah, I was thinking about that actually, because earlier we were getting ready for this. I was thinking, this is the first time we're doing children's literature. And you reminded me that we'd done Little Women. But they're quite different. Little Women is kind of juvenile literature. Do you know what I mean? It's geared toward children, but it's they're long, protracted, detailed chapters, longer paragraphs. It requires more of you, I think, narratively. So it's Little Women was kind of literature on the threshold between childhood and adulthood. And it was very preoccupied with that thematically. Remember, we talked about that a lot. This, though, is more, if we think about a spectrum of children's literature with Dr. Seuss all the way on the left-hand side, I think this is a little bit farther toward that axis. The playfulness of language and the almost nursery rhyme-like quality of some of the language.
Well, especially the poems that appear within it, which are very nursery rhyme-like.
Exactly. So it definitely falls farther on the spectrum than Little Women did.
I think one of the things with Little Women is that if you go back and reread just that first chapter, it is a lot more childlike than the rest of the book turns out to be.
Yeah.
It starts out very simple and concrete. Here are the four different sisters, and here's how the first one acts, and here's how the second one acts, and here it's laid out very simply, and then it becomes more complicated and more like a normal novel, let's say, in normative language by the middle and end of it, whereas this doesn't really change in that sense.
No, you're absolutely right about Little Women. There's definitely that very simple schematic almost kind of opening that then gets more elaborate and more complicated, more ambiguous, I think, as the narrative goes on. We talked a lot about that, especially in terms of gender roles. That was super cool. Here instead, you write that the style is much more continuous, much more stable. One of the things that struck me about it, though, in terms of the structure of the narrative, because I hadn't read this for quite a long time, since my kids were young, was how long it takes to get to the chocolate factory.
Yeah.
You know, there's like, I'd forgotten how much of the kind of backstory of the want and poverty and hardship part of the story there is before the big, candy-laden payoff and the peeling off of the bad children.
I was surprised how quickly, and I guess we're going to go into some of the plot details, but how quickly the kids were thrown away by the time that you arrive at the chocolate factory. It's like almost immediately the first child is gone.
Yep.
And I thought there might be a bit more just having them in the space, having them all marvel at the space before you get into that.
It's like playing a hand of cards. Like there's all this lead up until you get inside the gates of the factory. And then once you're there, it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you're left with the last one. It's like it's been building up to this all the way through.
The other thing that makes this more of a children's book, of course, is the illustrations.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there were illustrated versions of Little Women, at least with frontispieces, but this was illustrated throughout. It turns out that we have different illustrators in our 2 copies of this book. I've got a more recent set of illustrations by Quentin Blake.
And I've got illustrations by Joseph Schindelman, who I think did the first American edition.
So that's interesting. They're throughout the book. They're every few pages. You get at least one illustration.
And interwoven with the text in some ways. It's sometimes like running along like the top margin of 2 pages. I don't know if in your copy it's like that, but here there's sometimes like it'll be almost like a border of illustration that's running across the top of both pages, or intervening in the middle of a page to sort of punctuate it. Like when there's like an important announcement in the newspaper about how the Wonka factory is going to be opened at last to a lucky few, it appears at the end of chapter 4, and it's there almost like a big punctuation mark at the end. And what happens is, so Mr. Bucket held up the paper so that they could see the huge headline. The headline said, and then you don't get text. It's the picture of the newspaper.
Oh, that is text in my edition.
Oh, wow. Cool.
But it is, the illustrations are also integrated into the text in another way, especially at the very beginning when all the characters in Charlie's family are introduced. You get a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, and it says, this is Mr. Bucket, this is Mrs. Bucket.
Yeah, mine does this too.
And then you get a picture of this is Charlie. So, the illustrations are there as opposed to having text, as opposed to describing the characters physically. It's the illustration that's standing in for description.
It's very kid-friendly.
And very adult-friendly too, I'll say.
You were saying that you hadn't read these as a child.
That's right. I did not grow up reading Roald Dahl. I feel like I did not grow up reading a lot of the children's books that you are expected to grow up reading. But Roald Dahl is certainly on the list of things that I only came to as an adult, which I first encountered reading them to children. And then have read a few on my own and just sort of gorged myself on a bunch of them as we were getting up to the recording for this.
How was that? Do you feel like you like a surfeit of candy? Like are you like Roald Dahl'd out from all that, or what?
I think so. I've read about 7 or 8 or 9 of them in the last few days. And while there are a few left for me in this box set, I think I'm good. I think I'm good for a while.
Yeah.
I will happily come back to them at some point when I'm feeling in the mood for it. But right now, I think I'm okay.
Yeah, actually, I've read these books in both those ways. Like I'd read them as a child, or at least I'd read Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator. But then when I had kids, I bought the books for them. And in fact, the copy I have here of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is the one that my oldest daughter had when she was like maybe 7 or 8. I kept just looking at her childlike name scrawled in the front. And all the other books are from when my kids were little. So like they kind of inhabit 2 different places almost in my experience, which is so it made it interesting rereading them again for today.
And how did you and how did your children respond to the books?
I think everybody really liked them. For the kids in particular, I think it's very hard to disambiguate their experience of the books from their experience of the movies. Like, there's the 1971 Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which my kids loved. I think that one's actually called Willy Wonka, and it has a different title, right? And then there was that other remake more recently, some years ago with Johnny Depp, and they were a little more jaded about that one. But also, like, there's a really wonderful movie version of Matilda, and there was an animated Fantastic Mr. Fox that my son really liked. So for them, the books and the movies are kind of mixed up together, a little bit like their Harry Potter experiences, I think.
Yeah, and I should say that I did see Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory when I was a kid, and I didn't like it at all.
Oh.
The early scenes of the grandparents in the bed, there's something that just really did not sit well with me with that.
Yeah.
And possibly some of the later stuff as well. Just Wonka is not a staple character.
You're looking for stability. That's the wrong place to look.
Indeed.
I was thinking about this actually, because, you think about, I don't know, the Gene Wilder version of Willy Wonka in that movie, and then Johnny Depp trying to sort of out Wilder, that performance with his own. It was interesting thinking, going back to the book and thinking about, well, what is the Willy Wonka character like? Like one of the things I noticed, he's constantly speaking in exclamation points. In a way that's really distinct from all the other characters. So it's like this incredibly overinflated affect, this like, I don't know what to call it, manic kind of quality to it that is odd. It's like he inhabits a different way of being from all the other characters. And that's kind of interesting to think about.
But before we get to that, I think we should do a little bit of the basics.
Yeah. So Roald Dahl must have been an unbelievably difficult person to like, I think, because his books are, I think, anyway, both charming and hilarious. They're sparkling and dark, but it looks to me, just having read a little bit about his biography, he must have been someone very difficult to cope with. He alienated a lot of the people who were close to him. His behavior was, I don't know if it was misogynistic, but it certainly was like really bad to people in his family, people he was with. And there's evidence that he held anti-Semitic positions to such an extent that it interfered with honors that would have otherwise come his way later in life. So he's clearly a very problematic guy. He's best known for his children's literature, which we've been talking about a little bit, but also, and I don't know if you had read any of this stuff, he's also written quite a lot of adult literature, especially short stories, including, in my experience, some of the most horrifying horror stories I've ever read. There's one that's called Royal Jelly, which is literally the most terrifying short story I ever read in my entire life. I strongly recommend it. It's really awful.
Oh, boy.
It's also about food, interestingly enough. It's really icky. Anyway, so he's born in 1916, died in 1990, and born in Wales, brought up in England, but born to Norwegian parents. And this is something that is clearly important to him, and he writes about this actually in his memoir of his childhood called Boy. At the age of 18, after finishing public school, that is what we would call in North America private school, he headed out to East Africa, where he worked for the Shell Oil Company. And when the war broke out, he joined the Royal Air Force, had various kinds of adventures, ended up working again in the U.S. for some period of time before returning to the U.K. He started writing children's literature only after he'd already tried out being a writer for adults, writing various kinds of short pieces. And children's literature is where he really made it. In his personal life, he was married to the actress Patricia Neal, and that's also kind of an awful story in a lot of ways, I think. It looks like he was really, I don't know about abusive, but it looks like it was a really icky situation. And they had 5 children, which I mentioned because this had a really formative effect on him. One of his daughters died as a young child of encephalitis from measles. And so he became very active with regard to advocating vaccination. And that wistful sorrow, that awful experience of losing a child is something that is obliquely reflected in his books in different places. And I find that kind of moving. Anyway, his books include Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, of course, and also a sequel, Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator, which I loved as a child, but I don't think has aged quite as well as some of his other books. Matilda, another really fabulous one, The Fantastic Mr. Fox, The BFG, George's Marvelous Medicine, James and the Giant Peach, and so on. So which ones did you read? You read Charlie and the Chocolate Factory.
I read all the ones that you just listed.
Oh my God, you must be just dizzy.
And Boy.
And Boy. But I really like Boy. I think it's
Boy's
really
pretty interesting.
It's like a memoir up until he's like about, I don't know, his early 20s or something
yeah.
like that.
And then there's a sort of sequel memoir called Flying Solo, which I did not read because, time.
What did you like best of the things you read?
I quite liked Matilda. I quite liked Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I liked George's Marvelous Medicine.
Uh-huh.
I did enjoy Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, of course, but I did not really care for the sequel, which is just a bunch of random nonsense.
Yeah. But again, thinking about, as a kid, I really loved it, right? So, Yeah,
I might have enjoyed it as a kid. I have no idea. But it was not anything I wanted right now.
And again, I think they do get a bit repetitive, by which I mean not that the plots are repetitive, but one of the things about Dahl, I think, that is really appealing is his really interesting style. Like, it's very quick, it's very brisk, it's vivid, and the timing is really good. The way the sort of punchlines almost work, and once you've read a couple of the books that are in that style, the novelty wears off, right, of the style.
Yeah.
But, I'm not criticizing, but yeah.
It's also very cruel.
Yeah, which as a child is just great.
I suppose so.
I suppose it's really pathological, but I noticed that too. I was reading this stuff and, enjoying once again, particularly horrible passages, like savage passages. And, I have to give an example of one. He's actually going to grab an example from Boy, which is this memoir of his childhood. Let me find one real quick. Okay. So this is when the children are being punished one after another. Now it was our turn to jump. We looked round, and there, sitting in one of Mr. Coombs's big leather armchairs, was the tiny, loathsome figure of Mrs. Pratchett. She was bounding up and down with excitement. "Lay it into him," she was shrieking. "Let him have it. Teach him a lesson." And so, like, this loathsome figure of Mrs. Pratchett, this is just like an example of the contemptuous way he'll describe figures. And when you're reading it, especially when you're a child where, things are very black and white, there's good and bad and strong and weak, the kind of malevolence of the description is something that, I don't know, really speaks to children's sense of being treated unfairly, right? That like the only weapon they have at their disposal is that sort of contemptuous way of seeing adults in the world, right? And when you think about the ways in which his books are appealing, part of it is the vividness, the charmingness, and the candy, and the abundance, right? And the fantasy. But part of it is this willingness to see adults sometimes as benevolent, but sometimes as like monsters. And children are like that. Like I could even remember as a child, like when you get punished by one of your parents, or something like that, this visceral sense of hate and loathing of the adult that, makes you go to your room or doesn't let you do something or makes you go to bed. Like I remember that. And I think so even though like reading these books as an adult, you're like, oh, that's really horrible language. It's kind of like really repulsive. But as a child, it speaks powerfully, I think, to, I don't know, the passions. I don't know. I mean, at least that's my experience.
Dahl is very good at that extreme. He's very good at putting language to make things seem not just bad, but the worst thing ever. Or not just good, but the tastiest, most fabulous, most over-the-top, most unimaginably great thing ever.
Yeah, overwhelming emotion, right? And that is, that's the condition of childhood. I mean, because you haven't mastered that yet, right? As a child, you haven't learned to kind of damp it down. And that's, I think, one of the reasons for the continued appeal of those books, at least, to the kid audience.
And as we'll see, he doesn't reserve that kind of language for adults. He's certainly more than willing to throw that out for other kids. Let's do a quick plot summary of this book, just in case there's somebody out there who hasn't read it or seen the movie or doesn't know what happens.
And for some people, they might have seen it as a child or read it as a child, but the memory might be dim.
Indeed. So we've got Charlie Bucket, who is a very poor boy living in a very humble house with his parents and his 4 grandparents. And his one real delight in the world is the single Wonka chocolate bar that he's given each year for his birthday. This year, though, his birthday present might be extra special because it might contain one of the 5 golden tickets that Willy Wonka has hidden inside the wrappers of his chocolate bars. You see, Wonka has become a bit of a recluse over the years, and he never leaves his factory and never lets anyone else inside. But he's decided to let 5 children and their parents take a tour of his magnificent factory. Now, sadly, Charlie's birthday present doesn't actually contain a golden ticket. But then he stumbles upon a 50-pence coin in the ground and uses it to buy another chocolate bar, and that one has a ticket. And he's joined with 4 other children, each of which is miserable and insufferable and intolerable, all in their own ways. But as they explore the wonders of the factories, each of the nasty children is, well, seemingly destroyed, basically, when they disobey Wonka's orders. One, for instance, gets sucked up inside a chocolate pipe, and the other swells up like a massive blueberry. At the end, obedient and observant and very good Charlie is the last child remaining, and Wonka announces that he's going to give Charlie the factory. The end.
Yeah, one of the things I noticed when you were summarizing the plot, and it reminded me we must be reading different versions. In the one I was reading for today.
Did you have $1 he finds?
Yeah, it's a dollar bill that he finds in the snow. So they must have tailored that to the different audiences, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing that struck me too, and I mean, I must have always known this, but I never really thought about it quite that way, is that there's this really weird kind of symmetry between the ways in which at the beginning, there's the 4 grandparents and the 2 parents and Charlie. Like Charlie is like the very fragile, hope for the future that family has, right? These 4 incredibly aged and decrepit grandparents and these 2 poverty-struck parents, right? Like Charlie is kind of the last survivor in some way, out of this. And at the end, he's also in a sense the last survivor, like he's the last kid left, the last one standing. So that's a kind of really interesting and weird feature, I think, in the book.
Yeah, it all boils down to Charlie each time.
Mm-hmm.
But it's all sort of known in advance. Because Wonka knows right away that Charlie is the one. He says this at the end of it. But even from the beginning, the way he acts towards Charlie is different from the way he acts towards the other children.
In what ways?
Well, Wonka has this really fun habit of pretending not to hear people.
Speak a little louder.
And this is something he never has to do with Charlie.
No, because you say Charlie is like observant, right? He's a different kind of person. He's passive to a certain extent, right? And that's part of what sees him through.
Yeah, he's very passive, but thoughtful.
Yeah. Well, we're set up for that, right? By the early parts of the book. I was saying earlier that I'd forgotten how much of the book is that early stage before we ever get to the factory, when it's that depiction of kind of hunger and want and suffering really in that household, right? They're incredibly poverty struck. It's it's awful and it's funny, right? Because this is Roald Dahl, right? The family, the decrepit 4 grandparents all stay in this one bed all day and all night because they're so old and decrepit. The mother stays home taking care of these, aged grandparents. And the father works at the local toothpaste factory where he's the person who screws the caps on the toothpaste tubes. So their life is pretty austere. And then the toothpaste factory ceases to employ the father. So he no longer even can have his paycheck from putting the caps on the tubes of toothpaste. And they're even more dejected and more downcast and more impoverished. But in that kind of crucible of hunger and want, we get a sense of Charlie's character. And not just his character, but the nature of his family. So you mentioned earlier when you were summarizing the plot that every year for his birthday, Charlie gets this one single chocolate bar. And we read how he prolongs the experience of eating it by first not even opening it, just looking at it. And then he'll tear back one little corner and have a teeny tiny little morsel of it so he can prolong it over for a month or something like that. And he tries to invite his family to share his chocolate bar and they refuse it. He tries to give his mother a bite. She's like, certainly not. And the others all cried, no, we wouldn't dream of it. It's all yours. But neither Grandpa Joe nor anyone else would take even a tiny bite. So they're all hungry. This is the thing, right? They're all in a state of want, but they're not greedy, right? And this is going to be really important for what comes later.
And it works in the opposite direction as well when the father has lost his job and when the food supply is getting very, very thin. Mm-hmm. There's a section that goes, "That child," said Grandpa Joe, poking his head up from under the blanket one icy morning, "that child has got to have more food. It doesn't matter about us. We're too old to bother with. But a growing boy? He can't go on like this. He's beginning to look like a skeleton." "What can one do?" murmured Grandma Josephine miserably. "He refuses to take any of ours. I heard his mother tried to slip her own piece of bread onto his plate at the breakfast this morning, but he wouldn't touch it. He made her take it back." So there's a sense in which neither, no one is willing to take anyone else's food.
Yeah. And that was when I was reading that, it really struck me. It reminded me of that section in MFK Fisher's How to Cook a Wolf, where she talks about people who are living close to the bone. Remember the story of Sue, right? But you could still feast, right? You could still be generous. You could still be thoughtful. And then there's other passages where she talks about being in a state of hunger and want, and if you have children, whether you let them know about that or not, or invite them into that experience. And remember just the shared buttered toast. So here too, there's this really interesting scene where there's hunger and there's want, but there are people who are refusing to give in to greed or appetite or, I don't know, to let their hunger make them into beasts, right? There's something interesting going on here in that respect. One of the things that really struck me about the sort of hunger and want sections of this story is the role of chocolate. Chocolate will have, and every other kind of candy too, will have a different kind of role once we go inside the gates of the factory and we're in the fantastical world of the chocolate factory. But before that, chocolate is about satisfying hunger. It's not just about the sweetness and the rareness of having candy, right? It's also about just satisfying this primal want. And you see it in a whole bunch of different passages. Early on, there's this one description of how when Charlie would walk to school, he would see great slabs of chocolate piled up high on the shop windows, and he would stop and stare and press his nose against the glass, his mouth watering like mad. He would often see other children taking creamy candy bars out of their pockets and munching them greedily, and that, of course, was pure torture. And as their suffering gets greater, the father loses his job. The watered down cabbage soup that they've been eating for their various meals is now even more watered down and pathetic, right? And the state of hunger gets even more acute, right? Dahl writes, "There's something about very cold weather that gives one an enormous appetite. Most of us find ourselves beginning to crave rich steaming stews and hot apple pies and all kinds of delicious warming dishes. But Charlie Bucket never got what he wanted because the family couldn't afford it, and as the cold weather went on, he became ravenously and desperately hungry." And then just a little bit later, he finds that money that you mentioned in the summary, and he's going to take the money home to his mother, but beforehand, he just has to buy some chocolate. He's just overcome, right? He goes into the candy store, and the candy store guy gives Charlie a candy bar. Charlie grabbed it and quickly tore off the wrapper and took an enormous bite. Then he took another, and oh, the joy of being able to cram large pieces of something sweet and solid into one's mouth. The sheer blissful joy of being able to fill one's mouth with rich, solid food. It's such an interesting moment, right? Because on the one hand, it's about chocolate, sweet, delicious, confection, but it's also about hunger, right? It's not just chocolate that's sweet and delicious, right? It's rich, solid food.
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting because once you get into the factory, it's all fantastical food. It's not the thing that satisfies hunger anymore. It's the fantasy of food. But the first part of the book's about actual hunger.
Well, but in between these depictions of hunger and, before this scene, which will eventually lead to Charlie getting his golden ticket, we are introduced to the 4 other children. And they are all also filled with desire.
Yes, lots of appetite.
So, for example, the first one is Augustus Gloop, who is
he would be a personification of gluttony if this was a medieval book.
Indeed. He's a 9-year-old boy who was so enormously fat, he looked as though he had been blown up with a powerful pump. Great flabby folds of fat bulged out from every part of his body, and his face was like a monstrous ball of dough, with 2 small, greedy, currenty, like currants, like raisins, currenty eyes peering out upon the world. Now, body shaming aside,
yeah.
This is a remarkable depiction, a personification, as you said, of gluttony.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, you could, like I said, you can imagine these characters along in those terms, right? Like Veruca Salt too, right? Like she's avaricious, right? She just wants more and more and more.
Yeah, she's somebody for whom, if there is something nice in the world, she must have one.
Yeah. No, it's basically, you could make a really interesting juxtaposition of putting like Charlie in the Chocolate Factory and like Prudentius' Psychobakia together or something. It would be so interesting.
Indeed. But so there's an obvious level of actual, hunger with Charlie that you don't see with these other quite sated but never satisfied children.
That's it.
But to think about what exactly that means, what is the nature of that appetite that is never going to be sated in Augustus Gloop or Veruca Salt? What is that like, and how does that differ from Charlie's?
Well, there's a beautiful moment that I think illustrates that. I'm just looking to see if I can find it. It's where Charlie and all the others are en route between one part of the factory and another. And they're taking the boat and they're going along the river of chocolate. Here it is. I've got it. "Isn't it marvelous?" said Grandpa Joe, grinning at Charlie. Charlie nodded and smiled up at the old man. Suddenly, Mr. Wonka, who was sitting on Charlie's other side, reached down into the bottom of the boat, picked up a large mug, dipped it into the river, filled it with chocolate, and handed it to Charlie. "Drink this," he said. "It'll do you good. You look starved to death." Then Mr. Wonka filled a second mug and gave it to Grandpa Joe. "You too," he said. "You look like a skeleton. What's the matter? Hasn't there been anything to eat in your house lately?" And then Charlie drinks it, and a feeling of intense happiness spread all over him. "You like it?" Mr. Wonka said. "Oh, it's wonderful," Charlie said. And it's such an interesting moment because, chocolate is what they're having, but it's in a cup. It's warm. It's like, I don't know, like warm milk or tea or something, something nourishing and satisfying. And it's a gift, right? You look hungry. And so there's this little tiny transaction, but I think it's such an interesting moment because it's the one moment inside the chocolate factory where chocolate or candy appears as something nourishing and satisfying as opposed to the fantastical, vivid, weird thing it is elsewhere. It's a neat exchange, isn't it? I had never noticed it before until I read it for today.
It's true. It's interesting because Charlie, of course, appreciates it in a way that it seems the other children just aren't capable of.
Yes, that's right.
They're full of want that can't take a moment to appreciate when they actually have that want momentarily satisfied.
Yeah.
Whereas Charlie is able to do that. But it's interesting because that passage is tucked away within another thing which distracted me from noticing what you just noticed, which is, "Oh, the creamiest, loveliest chocolate I've ever tasted," said Grandpa Joe, smacking his lips. "That's because it's been mixed by waterfall," Mr. Wonka told him, which is a thing that Wonka's been going on about for a little bit, that, oh, you must mix it by waterfall. That's what makes Wonka chocolate taste better than all his competitors.
Yeah.
And it's an insane idea that this would have that much of an effect. But he's hammering on about it. And in this world of his that he's created, it could be true. So it's highlighting his eccentricity while also giving this little character defining moment for Charlie and Grandpa Joe.
Yeah. Well, character defining, I think that's exactly right. But it's also it's like this little moment where it's about actual hunger and satiation of hunger, and not about the slightly more superficial gratification that comes from delicious flavor or novelty. Do you know what I mean? Chocolate is nourishing in that moment in a way that it never is at any other time inside the factory.
Do you think that Wonka gets that kind of nourishment from chocolate?
Well, this is the thing. I think it has to be true, right? Because otherwise that's why he hands over the cup, right? Like he recognizes hunger.
But does he get satisfaction for himself from chocolate?
Yeah, I don't know.
Because it seems like it's driven him to a kind of mania.
Well, I mean, it would,
This quest for ever better, ever newer, ever more fantabulous chocolate making.
It's true.
They eventually get to the invention room, and it's just full of, tremendous new potential chocolates that have ludicrous qualities to them.
Yeah, it's absolutely fantastical. In that passage we used for the opening, one of the things that struck me about it is that it describes how you eat all these marshmallows that taste like violets, caramels that change color, feathery sweets that melt away when you put them between your lips, and these little blue birds' eggs that when you put them in your mouth, it gets smaller and smaller until all you're left with is a little pink sugary baby bird. It's like, what candy does that? It's like this fantasy of what candy could be. It's almost like a phoenix, right? Like where you end up with if you start with the feathery sweets and you end up with the baby bird, the pink baby bird on your tongue. It's like this weirdly hallucinogenic kind of thing. And some of the other descriptions too elsewhere in the factory are just like dizzying fantasy, like pushing the boundaries of the imagination, especially with regard to almost alchemical kind of mixture that's possible in the environment of the candy factory. So, for example, at one point they're in one of the inventing rooms and a mighty rumbling sound comes. And then suddenly the watchers noticed that runny stuff was pouring down the insides of all the hundreds of little glass tubes and squirting out into the great tub below. And in every single tube, the runny stuff was of a different color, so that all the colors of the rainbow and many others as well came sloshing and splashing into the tub. It all gets mixed up, different color liquids, frothing from blue to white, to green to brown to yellow, then blue again. And then there's a sucking noise and all the blue frothy mixture in the huge basin was sucked back into the stomach of the machine, and then in the drawer there lay something so small and thin and gray that everyone thought it must be a mistake. It looked like a little strip of gray cardboard. So there's this really hallucinogenic scene where it's like everything, it's all the colors of the rainbow, right? The full spectrum, and many others as well. What does that even mean? Right? I mean, all the colors of the rainbow and others? There are no others.
No, there are plenty of colors that aren't in the rainbow. Think about brown.
Well, I guess. I mean, I think of the rainbow as being by definition, all the colors, but okay. Anyways, but then it's like frothing. So it's like changing from one state of matter to another. And the machine itself is almost like an organism, right? It sucks the liquid back into the stomach of the machine and then something comes out, like something's transmuted. And what you're left with is a very anticlimactic looking little gray strip.
Well, anticlimactic except for one of the children, because it's a stick of gum.
Yes, by gum.
One of the children, Violet Beauregard, is absolutely obsessed with gum.
Yeah. And the thing is so fascinating is that there's this almost alchemical kind of transmutation. What you're left with is the little gray strip. But then once it gets inside of her, it becomes all these things again, right?
Right. It's a chewing gum meal. It'll give you a 3-course dinner of the tomato soup, some roast beef, and then a blueberry pie.
Yeah, the blueberry pie does not end well.
No, because of course this is still under development. And so, although she is warned on multiple occasions not to have it, Violet Beauregard has to have this exciting treat, and she picks it up and she chews on it and she puffs up like a giant blueberry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she's told not to, but she does it anyway. It's quite magnificent. There was no saving her now. Her body was swelling up and changing shape at such a rate that within a minute it had turned into nothing less than an enormous round blue ball, a gigantic blueberry. But one of the things so fascinating is, you were talking before about the description of Augustus Gloop's body, right? Like he's like this enormously fat child who has like a great big bun with currants for eyes almost, right? These bodies of these children get described in very visceral ways, and they're also changed, almost like metamorphosed from one state of being to another. So Augustus falls into the river, sucked up into the tube, sent down to the fudge room, and he ends up looking very different by the end. Right. And then Violet ends up very different by the end too, because even though they squeeze her to get out all the juice, she remains purple. Mike TV ends up, I won't go into detail about what happens to him, but he ends up looking very different because he's miniaturized and then he has to be stretched out again. And also because of one of the curative vitamins that's administered to him, his toes grow out until they're as long as his fingers, so he can play the piano with his feet. So each of these children ends up looking very different, almost transformed, except for Veruca Salt, interestingly enough, who's handled a bit differently. She's covered in trash. It's so interesting. I never noticed it before, but like everybody is metamorphosed one way or the other. And the song of the Oompa Loompas, who we're going to talk about, really emphasizes this. When they're talking about Augustus Gloop right after he disappears, they're like, he will be altered quite a bit. He'll be quite changed from what he's been when he goes through the fudge machine. 100 knives go slice, slice, slice. We add some sugar, cream, and spice. We boil him for a minute more. And then it goes on and on and on about him. So what actually happens is he ends up being, I think he ends up being squeezed. Let me find it.
Yes. Yeah, no. Augustus gets squeezed in the pipe.
Oh, right. Grandpa Joe says at the end, he used to be fat. Now he's as thin as a straw, right? And so Augustus, his body changes shape. Violet inflates into a blueberry, gets dejuiced, so she's the same size, but she's permanently purple. Mike TV had been miniaturized, and then he's stretched out, 10 feet tall and thin as a wire because he's been overstretched on the gum stretching machine. Oops. Veruca Salt, though, and her parents are simply covered with garbage, right? And it's really different. It's almost like the others undergo a bodily change to kind of, I don't know, mark on their bodies. Like it's almost like a visible reminder of their transgression. Like again, if we think about this as kind of allegorical personifications, they bear the mark of their excess. Whereas the salts are just continue to be covered in garbage, like as if they were garbage and they're, you know what I mean? Like remember they get thrown away by Veruca seen as a bad nut by the squirrels. Remember the squirrels throw her down the garbage chute?
So that's part of it, but also they are acquisitive. This is the thing about Veruca Salt is that she wants everything.
Yes.
And so sort of like a hoarder, she's just covered in garbage rather than the objects that she wants.
Yeah. Yeah. The acquisitiveness is just, it's just like becomes filth, right? It's very Dante-like, again, if I was going to, teach this text, I would put it with Prudentius' Psychowikia and Dante's Inferno because it's like the Contrapasso, right? People undergo changes. These children, they undergo changes that correspond to their excess, right? To their sin, so to speak. It's so weird.
It's terrific. So we mentioned the Oompa Loompas who sing songs throughout the piece that are very nursery rhyme-like, and they're also very much sort of a Greek chorus commenting on what's going on.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way, but you're absolutely right. They do function that way. They are super weird, super colonial and creepy and all kinds of, there's a lot to say about the Oompa Loompas.
Oh, yeah.
Because they're like, I want to say enslaved. I mean, it's always represented as a deal that the Oompa Loompas are totally happy with, though of course it's only Mr. Wonka who tells us about how the Oompa Loompas came to the factory. He says they're totally happy. Certainly they're singing, right? But the fact is that Mr. Wonka, we get the backstory from Grandpa Joe at an early point in the story. There used to be workers, but one day Mr. Wonka got frustrated with the fact that the workers were selling his secrets to other companies, and he just sent all the workers home, closed the gates of the factory, game over. And then after a few months, all of a sudden the factory started working again. So there's workers, but they're enclosed entirely within the walls of the factory. Says the Oompa Loompas.
Right.
And it's interesting. And again, I noticed this for the first time reading for today. It's as soon as you cross the liminal space of the gate, right? You cross the gate into the factory, and that's the first thing you hear about is the workers. Did you notice that?
Oh, no, interesting.
It's so weird. So they come in, right? Charlie glanced back over his shoulder and saw the great iron entrance gate slowly closing behind him. Then, as the gates closed with a clang, all sight of the outside world disappeared. And they go through. Mr. Wonka says, "Through this big red door, please. That's right. It's nice and warm inside. I have to keep it warm inside the factory because of the workers. My workers are used to an extremely hot climate. They can't stand the cold. They'd perish if they went outdoors in this weather. They'd freeze to death." "But who are these workers?" asked Augustus Gloop. "All in good time, my dear boy," said Mr. Wonka. Right? So it's like the first thing you hear about. And then they finally appear like about maybe 10 pages later as almost a kind of a marvel.
And then eventually you hear the story of how they came to be working in his factory.
Exactly. Mr. Wonka tells you the backstory, how he shipped them over, every man, woman, and child in the Oompa Loompa tribe. It was easy. I smuggled them over in large packing cases with holes in them, and they all got here safely. They're wonderful workers. They all speak English now.
"They're imported directly from Loompa Land," said Mr. Wonka proudly. "There's no such place," said Mrs. Salt. "Excuse me, dear lady, but Mr. Wonka," cried Mrs. Salt, "I'm a teacher of geography." "Then you'll know all about it," said Mr. Wonka, which is another interesting thing. This idea that, well, they're from this land, but it's not a land that is familiar to geographers. It's not a land that exists.
Yeah, well, I know, but like this is the thing, right? Yeah, like it's not like Roald Dahl does not know about like colonial cultures. Maybe he was stationed in East Africa right before World War II, right?
Yep.
I'm sure there's a lot to say about this, And so he's got these people who are from a tribe, who are wonderful workers. They all speak English now. They love dancing and music. The men wear deer skins, the women wear leaves, and the children wear nothing at all. It's like
They come from thick jungles.
Yeah. Right? So it's like super creepy.
And of course, famously in the original edition, the Oompa Loompas were black.
I didn't even know that.
Oh, yeah.
No, wow.
Yeah, it was when the film was going to be made in the early 70s, after the book had been out for a few years. I guess that a lot of conversations around that inappropriate depiction were brought up, and they decided to change them into white-skinned hippie types, basically.
You mean in the movie, the 1971 movie?
Well, in the movie, they're treated in a different way as well.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
in the
you
book
mean that like
came
in the
out,
book, they changed the way they were. Did they change the text of the book?
They changed the text of the book and the illustrations.
Oh, wow. I did not know that.
Yeah.
Oh, that's just even ickier.
Yeah. No, it's pretty gross.
No. The other moment that I felt like I was almost tempted to understand it as part of that whole colonialism and colonial anxiety was the scene where the massive squirrels turn on Veruca. Do you remember that scene?
I do. How are you seeing this as colonial?
Well, tell me what you think. It's just this very strange moment where, so Veruca wants some of these trained squirrels, and Mr. Salt's like, "Okay, Wonka, name your price." Mr. Wonka's like, "No, she can't have one." Veruca's like, "I'm going to go get one." So she goes in. The girl had already thrown open the door and rushed in. The moment she entered the room, 100 squirrels stopped what they were doing and turned their heads and stared at her with small black beady eyes. Veruca Salt stopped also and stared back at them. And then she tries to grab one of the squirrels, and then they attack her. It's like a strange moment because it's like the animals are tremendously anthropomorphized there, I feel like. Mm-hmm. Right? There's 100 squirrels. They stop, they turn their heads, and they look at her. Right? And I don't know, it struck me as a strange animal-human moment. Where they're animals and they're like these desirable objects. Veruca wants one. She wants to take it home. And then they all of a sudden become aggressors.
Well, and not only that, so the squirrel's job in the factory is to test whether the nuts are good or not. So they knock to see whether the nuts are hollow. If the nuts are hollow, then they're not going to be any good for making into candies. So they toss them into the garbage ditch. And then of the 100 squirrels, 99 of them hold on to various parts of Veruca. And then one more comes over and wraps her on the head. And they say, "Save her," screamed Mrs. Salt. "Veruca, come back. What are they doing to her?" "They're testing her to see if she's a bad nut," said Mr. Wonka. "You watch." And so not only have the squirrels been anthropomorphized and been given these jobs, but Veruca has been, what's the term, de-anthropomorphized. She's now just a nut.
Yeah.
And she's going to be a very bad nut and one that needs to be ejected and one, tossed down the garbage hole.
Yeah, she's being processed. That's interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way. But it totally makes sense because that's what happens to these children's bodies, right? They get processed, right? Augustus is sent off to the fudge room where in the Song of the Oompa Loompas, he gets chopped and sliced and, boiled up into fudge. But he doesn't actually boil them into fudge, but the Oompa Loompas talk about him in this kind of cooking and preparing kind of language. And then with Violet Beauregard, right, she puffs up with juice that she has to be squeezed. And so she's processed in some certain kind of way. Mike TV too, his body gets kind of processed when it gets re-stretched out in the gum stretching machine.
Mm-hmm.
And then Veruca too, right? She's processed, she's a bad nut. So it's I don't know, the children's bodies are reduced into foodstuffs, like the stuff that goes into the machine of the candy factory.
Yeah.
That's so creepy. I mean, totally appropriate because they're evil little children, but it's really creepy.
Yeah, but it's interesting. It's because this is an imaginative space. Even it's inside a book, but also because the factory is sort of Wonka's imaginative space. It is his fantasy world. Mm-hmm. He's seemingly created this fantasy race of Africans to enslave ? He's created all these fantasy chocolates and treats that he's devised that have ridiculously impossible qualities. Uh-huh. And similarly, he sort of can imagine these children to undergo these terrible punishments, but also be fine. Violet Beauregard inflates both like a plump blueberry, but also like the bubble gum that she's, chewing and presumably blowing into bubbles, and then has to be extruded, has to have the juice taken out of her. And while she does stay purple, she survives all this. But because this is all happening in this imaginative space, it can happen.
Yeah.
And it is a space where these horrible children, these archetypes for the horrible children that Roald Dahl meets in the street every day, can get their just desserts, so to speak.
Well, that's what I was thinking about Dante and the Contrapasso, right? It's in Dante's Inferno, you have this almost machine of hell where everybody is having a corresponding punishment that matches up to their transgression played out on their bodies over and over and over again, right? So I think it's the schismatics, right, are having their bodies rent open. And by the time they make their way all the way around the circle, the wounds have healed up, but then they get hacked open again at the beginning of each circle. So it's a reiterative kind of thing. Their bodies don't get used up by the suffering. The children here are a little different from that, but they too, their bodies persist, even though they go through this processing by the machine.
So this isn't, of course, the only Roald Dahl book that has interesting, problematic contrapasso scenes with food. In Matilda, for example, there's a very notable scene where a student, Brucey, has been caught eating a slice of cake that he shouldn't have eaten. And then his punishment by the terrible headmistress.
The Trunchbull.
Yes, the Trunchbull is to eat an entire cake that was specially made for him as punishment.
In front of the entire school, the Trunchbull, the headmistress, forces him to eat it. The whole thing.
The whole thing. It's an absolutely, massive, disgusting amount of cake then. And the idea is that he's going to eat it and he's going to, get sick and he's going to embarrass himself in front of all the other students and it's going to learn him right. But it doesn't.
No. It's so great. I found the passage. I'm going to read a little bit of it. And now a subtle change was coming over the 250 watching children in the audience. Earlier on, they had sensed impending disaster. They had prepared themselves for an unpleasant scene in which the wretched boy, stuffed to the gills with chocolate cake, would have to surrender and beg for mercy. And then they would have watched the triumphant Trunchbull forcing more and still more cake into the mouth of the gasping boy. Not a bit of it. Bruce Bogtrotter was 3/4 of the way through and still going strong. One sensed that he was almost beginning to enjoy himself. He had a mountain to climb, and he was jolly well going to reach the top or die in the attempt. This was nothing less than a battle between him and the mighty Trunchbull. Right? And the audience is totally with him. He's like a long-distance runner who has sighted the finish line and knows he must keep going. So it's a hilarious scene. One of the things I was enchanted by is I've got the copy of Matilda that was my kids, and when I picked it up, it opened right to that page, right? Because so obviously they love that scene, right?
Oh, it's such a good scene.
And it's a great scene. But it's also like a childish victory, right? Children are expecting humiliation, right? They're expecting to see a scene of a child being humiliated by an adult.
Yeah.
But instead, Bruce triumphs with the cake.
And it's still a kind of disgusting scene.
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely.
And it's not one that's a perfect triumph, right? He finishes the cake. All the other students are amazed. And then Suddenly, the Trunchbull lunged forward and grabbed the large, empty china platter on which the cake had rested. She raised it high in the air and brought it down with a crash right on the top of the wretched Bruce Bogtrotter's head, and pieces flew all over the platform. Like, he still gets punished, but of course, who cares? He's clearly already won.
That's it. That's it. It's a victory of sorts, right?
Yeah.
So that's a really interesting moment, right? Where so childish hunger and satiation is also a danger, right? And this is something we thought about a little bit when we were talking about MFK Fisher. There's that wonderful short narrative she has that's been reprinted in a couple of different places where she talks about the experience of being in a country restaurant at lunch, being the only guest and being fed course after course, delicious food, but where it's also like she's climbing a mountain, like she doesn't think she's going to be able to eat another bite. So it's both wonderful and torture.
Right.
Right. Food can be both of these things. And food shows up in Boy as well. Did you notice some of those passages?
It shows up quite a lot. In fact, there's a massive section early on. We talked a bit about the passage of the sweet shop that is near this school that he's going to.
Yeah.
And the terrible woman who runs it with her very grubby hands, reaching in and grabbing the sweets. But what are you going to do?
You got to have the sweets, man.
And that kind of prank that they pull on her. There's also much later a chapter that talks about when he's older, but still in a boarding school. The Cadbury people send them new types of chocolate bar and ask for their feedback on them because, that's the target audience. And the people at this fancy school will be able to articulate what exactly they think about them. And this was the seed, in some ways, for Charlie and the Chocolate Factory much later in his life.
Yeah, no, those passages are wonderful. And in Boy, I also love the passages that are about other kinds of food. That is not just sweets, but other kinds of food. There's this one beautiful passage where he's talking about feasting with his family in Norway when he's a child. So he's one of a whole bunch of siblings, and they go to the extended family in Norway in the summers. And he describes a celebration feast. It started with fish, a massive fish, a flounder as big as a tea tray and as thick as your arm was brought to the table. It had nearly black skin on top, which was covered with brilliant orange spots, and it had, of course, been perfectly poached. Large white hunks of this fish were carved out and put onto our plates, and with it we had hollandaise sauce and boiled new potatoes. Nothing else. And it was delicious. And then afterward, he says, an enormous craggy mountain of homemade ice cream would be carried in. There were thousands of little chips of crisp burnt toffee mixed into it, and as a result, it didn't simply melt in your mouth like ordinary ice cream. You chewed it and it went crunch, and the taste was something you dreamed about for days afterward. But the really wonderful part of this passage comes immediately after when he talks about when the guzzling was over, those who were considered old enough were given small glasses of homemade liqueur, a colorless but fiery drink that smelled of mulberries. The glasses were raised again and again, and the sculling seemed to go on forever. That is the toasting. And that colorless but fiery drink, a little bit like what we saw in Hemingway's Movable Feast, where it's delicious and fiery, right? It's like berries, but it's also like liquid fire, right? And it's part of the ceremonial quality of food that brings people together. He describes toasting with his grandmother, his beste mama. You lift your glass. She will then lift her own glass and hold it up high. At the same time, your own eyes meet hers, and you must keep looking deep into her eyes as you sip your drink. After you've both done this, you raise your glasses high up again in a sort of final, silent salute, and only then does each person look away and set down his glass. He says if there are 10 people present, you'll scold each one of your 9 companions once individually, and you'll also be scolded. So you get 18 in all. By the time I was 10, he says, I'd be permitted to take part in these ceremonies, and I always finished up as tipsy as a lord. And I mean, it's funny, right? But it's also very beautiful, right? She lifts her glass, you lift your glass, your eyes meet, you keep looking into each other's eyes while you drink, and then afterward you raise your glasses, and only then does each person look away and set down his glass. So the idea that food brings you together, right? That scene where Mr. Wonka, fills the cup with chocolate and gives it to Charlie right when Charlie and his grandfather have been looking at one another, and then fills another cup for the grandfather. I mean, that kind of food, right? The food that brings people together into one moment. Those are, I think, hypnotically beautiful moments.
The other thing with that scene with the big feast was that, if I'm understanding this correctly, they're stopping to visit their grandparents en route to a different island. Mm-hmm, where they would be spending their vacation with the family, but maybe not with the grandparents.
No.
So you have this sense of, you see the grandparents for a day, maybe 2, but it's really centered around this feast. This feast
Yes.
is what you do with your grandparents.
That's right.
And it seemed like a really lovely sense of like, we are gathered together. We see each other once a year.
Mm-hmm.
Communication is difficult. We're going to eat and we're going to drink and we're going to do this thing that we do every time we see each other.
Yeah, and we're together in that moment.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what the sculling is about. Like, it's playful and funny, but it's also, I think, very moving.
And that passage reminded me more of the Hemingway that we looked at.
Me too. There's another passage of abundant food that appears also during the time in Norway after leaving the grandparents and heading off to the remote island where they spend their time swimming and, horsing around and doing things that children do. He describes breakfast, which is intoxicating. It's got all the multiplicity and dizzying fecundity of the chocolate factory, right? In Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, but it's real food. There were large jugs of milk, which all Norwegian children drink at every meal. There were plates of cold beef, veal, ham, and pork. There was cold-boiled mackerel submerged in aspic. There were spiced and pickled herring fillets, sardines, smoked eels, and cod's roe. There was a large bowl piled high with hot-boiled eggs. There were cold omelets with chopped ham in them, and cold chicken, and hot coffee for the grown-ups, and hot crisp rolls baked in the hotel kitchen, which we ate with butter and cranberry jam. There were stewed apricots and 5 or 6 different cheeses, including the ever-present Geitost, that tall, brown, sweet Norwegian goat's cheese, which you find on just about every table. Right? So it's multiple. It's like the Chocolate Factory in the sense of this abundance, but it's nourishing food as opposed to the ephemera of candy.
Mm.
It's neat, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Oh, he's a good writer. He might have been an incredible jerk, but he's a good writer.
Well, we are reaching the end of the year, and we have decided that we're going to do something a little bit different for December. We're going to be doing a special one-off episode looking at a writer whose work was very important, very much a great books author, who passed away this year.
Yeah, Toni Morrison's beloved.
Yes. Now, have you read this before?
I haven't. I actually tried to read it, I think, probably just a few years after it came out when my first 2 children were very small, and I couldn't read it. I mean, I just couldn't get through it.
No, fair enough. It's definitely difficult if you have small children.
Yeah, and so I think reading it together this month will be really moving. We're looking forward to that.
Yeah, well, I hope you can get through it.
Well, I'm in a different place, so maybe it will feel different. So that's going to be a one-off, and then we may do another one-off right around the New Year. So that'll be a neat way to punctuate our own anniversary coming up in January.
Yeah. Well, we'll tell you more about that later. But in the meantime, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter at @thespouter. We'd love to hear from you. Show notes with links for anything we mentioned in this episode will be at megaphonic.fm/spouter/21. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the many fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time,
see you again at the Spouter-Inn.